gender, kinship, and captivity in pre-colonial Africa. And so what we're going to be looking at is slavery in Africa itself, to sort of set up a contrast with what we discuss when we talk about slavery in the Americas. The really critically important thing to keep in mind is that enslavement is pretty much universal in world history. Most societies, if not all societies, had a type, a option of slavery, of enslaving people. But it could work very differently depending on where you are. So in Africa, what we're looking at is a political economy that focuses on controlling people. There's a lot of land in Africa, but comparatively, there's a limited population to occupy that land. So whether or not you are a wealthy person, whether or not you have a lot of political authority, whether you have a lot of social status, depends on the number of people you can control, either through convincing them to be your followers, by marrying them, by producing them as children, or by enslaving them. And slaves are basically a shortcut to what otherwise is a complicated procedure of getting people to support you. So there's sort of a shortcut to status. To be a slave is to be a kinless person, to not have the ties to your ancestors, to not have the ties to the generations to follow, to be isolated in African society, not have the connections that everybody depends on to locate themselves. To be free was to belong, to have the social connections, to be tied into reciprocal networks of kinship and mutual obligation, to have connections, to be protected from extreme exploitation, to have the right to marry, to inherit, to claim the labor of one's own children. All of those things go with being free. How slavery worked varied depending across Africa, but one way that it's sort of been divided up is this concept of high density versus low density systems. And you have to realize this is not a racial system of slavery for the most part. This is instead a little bit more complicated than that. And it's historically contingent, which means it can be different in different places at different times. The household framework, the version of low-density slavery, that means that enslaved people are a smaller proportion of the overall population, that they were used to build up a family household, to build up a lineage, to build up a royal retinue. Usually, if you were an enslaved person in that situation, you would often work directly in the fields with the persons who you belonged to. You probably ate the same kind of food. You probably slept near them in the same household. And over time, you might become socially assimilated into that household, into that community. However, people might remember for generations that you or your children or your children's children were descendants of enslaved people. High-density slavery, on the other hand, is a much more commercial version. It's much closer to what we think of when we think of slavery in the Americas and the Atlantic world. They were a significant part of the population and used primarily for economic reasons, to gain wealth and property. The labor was organized to produce wealth as much as possible, as quickly as possible. So you're talking about people working in large units to create, to produce wealth. Mining in the salt mines, weaving cloth, producing goods that are goods for sale, that are goods that are wealth for the household you work for. And we particularly see this in the Islamic savanna of West Africa, starting in the 16th century, in the Kingdom of Congo. And in these cases, it was much harder to become part of the community. Your status as an enslaved person was much more permanent. One additional thing about it is that in terms of enslavement, women were the core demographic because women were valuable because they were dually valuable. So what they're looking at, particularly in Africa, is they're looking to enslave women compared to the Atlantic slave trade, which, while it also enslaved women, was a little biased towards enslaving men. The advantage of women from the African perspective is they are both labor. They do an incredible amount of work in agriculture and domestic workloads, doing things like hoeing fields, preparing food, hauling firewood. And often if you were a free African woman, you might want to inquire an enslaved woman to do a lot of your household chores and free you up from that kind of domestic burdens. They also, however, produce children. And because they are kinless outsiders, their children belong to the lineage of either their master's household or the father. So if a man has a child with a free woman, that child belongs to his lineage, but it also belongs to the mother's lineage. But if he has a child with an enslaved woman, that child belongs entirely to him and his lineage. What enslaved women did was a wide variety of things. They could do domestic work. They often did agricultural work. They could be concubines. They could be traders. They could even be soldiers or tax collectors, depending on the society. However, in general, they were often used for sexual services, sexual exploitation. And their physical traits, their bodies, were commodified, used to set their price, depending on the size of their breasts, the shape of their body, all those kinds of things, their age, etc. In low-density systems, if they were somebody who was young enough to reproduce, that would give them extra status as an ideal potential slave wife to be assimilated into the household as a producer of children, or alternatively as a political gift to give to allies to try to build up diplomatic connections. Where do enslaved people come from? They come from violence, for the most part. Slavery was sustained by kidnapping, by warfare. A lot of times enslaved people were prisoners of war. In some cases, it was also a case where somebody had committed a crime or had fallen into debt. And if your father fell into debt, then you, his household, fell into debt as well and could be turned into value to get him out of debt. Because usually the slave populations didn't really reproduce themselves in these settings, due to the fact that various people became free because people died or people became integrated into the household, you always needed new enslaved people. And so it was an incentive for these systems of warfare, these systems of kidnapping, to continue over time. There was an illusion, and you have to be really careful with this, about the idea that to be enslaved in Africa is a much happier thing than to be enslaved in the Americas. And when I was teaching world history, we would read Olaudah Equiano's autobiography, in which he talks about his experiences. And one of the things he talks about is the household where he had been kidnapped, he had been sold through various different households and people, and he was in a household where he was treated well, he was allowed to eat at the table, he was treated like the equivalent of the grandson. And I would always have students use that as evidence that slavery was much less harmful in Africa. The problem with that is one day they woke him up and they sold him. So you have the illusion of happiness, the illusion of intimacy, and maybe there's some truth to that, but there's also always the reality that you can become an item of commerce. There's a proverb from Central Africa. You call him brother, age mate. Put your arm around his neck. Give him palm wine and meat. He thinks you love him. Then when your mother's brother dies, you kill him to be buried as part of the rites. So it's much more complicated than simply happy enslaved people in Africa, unhappy enslaved people in the Americas. Enslaved people negotiated and resisted their commodification, their use, their lowered status, their exclusion, their outsider status as much as possible. They manipulated the system. They tried to make as many claims as possible. And they pushed towards getting out of being enslaved and moving towards freedom as much as they could for themselves, or at least for the next generation. So finally, sort of to take this away, pre-17th century African slavery, and this is before the Atlantic slave trade really gets going, which really transforms the experience of enslavement, was an institution centered on the acquisition of insider status through the exploitation of outsiders. In other words, using enslaved people to build up the resources that benefited and improved your life as an insider. For women, that meant that they were an important resource because they produced children and because of the labor they produced.